A German intelligence report from the Normandy campaign, later captured, translated, and filed in the U.S. National Archives, contains an admission its own author probably never expected an enemy archive to preserve. He'd spent that August trying to do the one job his entire posting existed for, predicting where American reconnaissance units would turn up next. And he simply couldn't manage it. Not because the Americans concealed their movements especially well, because, as he put it, American reconnaissance elements didn't seem to follow any doctrine he could identify at all. They showed up where the map said they shouldn't be able to. They vanished before anyone could fix a position on them. They fought when standard practice called for a withdrawal and pulled back when a fight would clearly have favored them. In 4 years of professional intelligence work, he called it the single most unsettling pattern he'd ever encountered. That report is dated August 1944. Within weeks, the same officer would be watching 2 entire panzer brigades, brand new, straight off the factory floor, crewed by men trained on the best armor Germany still had the capacity to build, get quietly taken apart by a force that shouldn't have been able to locate them, let alone destroy them this efficiently. German troops had already given Patton's cavalry scouts an unofficial nickname born out of genuine confusion, coined by men who kept running into units that seemed to materialize from nowhere, hit hard, and disappear again before any coordinated response could form. They called them the Ghosts. This isn't a story about better vehicles or better radios, though the vehicles and radios both mattered. It's a story about a fundamentally different philosophy of what reconnaissance was actually for, one that broke rules the German army had spent 3 decades carefully codifying, and one built, like a great deal of America's wartime capability, directly out of the wreckage of an earlier and genuinely humiliating failure. To understand why the Ghosts were so hard to predict, you first have to understand what German reconnaissance doctrine expected reconnaissance to be, because on paper it was genuinely sophisticated. The Wehrmacht's approach, built around a concept called Aufklärung, roughly clearing up, making the battlefield picture clear before committing anything heavier, sent reconnaissance units forward to achieve local superiority in whatever ground they were scouting, advancing by careful bounds, maintaining continuous observation, thorough rather than reckless. But it operated inside one specific, mostly invisible assumption. A German motorized column probing toward a suspected enemy position that ran into resistance was supposed to pull back, report, and wait for the command structure above it to decide whether heavier forces should get committed. It gathered information. It did not become part of the information. German doctrine treated reconnaissance as an eye meant to see without being seen. And baked into that doctrine was the quiet assumption that any competent opposing army would treat its own reconnaissance units the same way, as observers rather than fighters, never appearing 15 miles behind German lines to ambush a supply column, take prisoners, radio results back, and vanish again before anyone could respond. That assumption cost a great many German soldiers their lives, because it required something Germany simply didn't have in comparable abundance by 1944, industrial output large enough to build, as American factories eventually would, more than 8,000 armored cars purpose-built for exactly this reconnaissance role, logistics deep enough that light units could operate independently for days without resupply, and a working military culture genuinely comfortable blurring the line between what a unit was technically supposed to do and what it could plausibly get away with doing. The Americans called the result flexibility. German after-action reports, less charitably, called it chaos. Both descriptions were accurate. To understand how that chaos actually got built, you have to go back to a mountain pass in Tunisia, where American reconnaissance, and nearly everything else about the American army, had first been tested against German armor and found badly wanting. In February 1943, Kasserine Pass produced the worst defeat the U.S. Army suffered anywhere in the European theater, a battle this channel has covered at length elsewhere. So I won't retell it here beyond the single detail that actually matters for this story. German High Command studied that collapse carefully and drew conclusions from it that shaped their planning assumptions for the following 18 months. What Germany missed entirely was that the Americans experienced Kasserine not as defeat to be rationalized away, but as raw data. Within days, American officers were filing after-action reports with a level of blunt institutional honesty unusual for any army in that war. Not our men fought bravely against overwhelming odds, but here is exactly what broke down, at what moment, and why. That honest accounting eventually reached down into a branch of the Army. Nobody was writing intelligence assessments about at the time. Not the tank divisions, not the artillery, but the cavalry, which in 1940 had still been sorting out something close to an identity crisis. Some regiments still mounted on actual horses. The Army fully aware it needed modern mechanized reconnaissance, but without any real doctrine yet for how that reconnaissance should actually fight once it made contact. By January 1944, the answer had taken concrete shape around the M8 light armored car, nicknamed the Greyhound by the British, built by Ford at its Minnesota plants. More than 8,500 of them by the time production ended in June 1945. The most produced armored car of the entire war. By the conventional metrics of armor and firepower, the Greyhound was frankly outclassed by nearly everything Germany fielded. 13 millimeters of frontal armor, a 37 millimeter gun with no meaningful effect on a Panther from the front, 16,000 pounds fully loaded. Judged purely on those numbers, you'd be missing the entire point of the vehicle. The M8 could do 55 miles an hour on a road, ran quieter than comparable armor, and carried enough fuel for roughly 400 miles without resupply, plus both long and short-range radios in every single vehicle. It wasn't built to fight a tank. It was built to be somewhere a tank simply couldn't catch it, see something a tank couldn't see, and get the information back to headquarters before the enemy had any chance to respond to it. Put 6 of those in a troop, give that troop an officer who genuinely understood his job wasn't to survive contact, but to generate useful information from it, and attach that troop to a cavalry group of roughly 1,700 men, answering to corps-level command rather than a division that would naturally constrain its independence. And you get a structure that, combined with equipment nobody else fielded in the same numbers, produced something the Germans had never encountered before. Light reconnaissance units with the doctrinal freedom and, frankly, the attitude to treat information gathering as an act of aggression rather than passive observation. The story first reached the American public in a Veterans Day newspaper feature published November 11, 1944, under a title that stuck, The Ghosts of Patton's Army, borrowing the nickname the Germans had already given them. What the ghosts were actually doing on French roads that summer inverted essentially every assumption German intelligence procedures had been built around. Patton's Third Army was moving east across France that summer at a pace with no real precedent in modern warfare, roughly 300 miles in 3 weeks. Entire German formations bypassed or simply outrun before they could establish any coherent defensive line. The Red Ball Express running 6,000 trucks on continuous 24-hour shifts, just to keep the spearhead supplied. At the very tip of that spearhead, in the dust and burning summer heat, rode the 2nd Cavalry Group under Colonel Charles Reed, serving as the reconnaissance element for Patton's 12th Corps, and by the time the sweep through France ended, covering something on the order of 3,000 miles of ground. On paper, this was a unit built purely for observation. In practice, it had become something the German army genuinely had no doctrinal box to file under. Lieutenant Raymond Kratz, a tank commander from Chicago, summed up the operating philosophy in a wartime dispatch about as plainly as it's ever been put. Speed, teamwork, and fast, straight shooting. No confusion once the noise starts. Make your hits, then get out. In practice, that meant a 2nd Cavalry patrol probing ahead of the Corps advance might stumble straight into a German column moving down a parallel road, and where German doctrine called for a light reconnaissance element to disengage immediately, report, and wait for something heavier to be sent. The American patrol instead simply assessed the threat, assessed its own capability, and did whatever seemed most likely to produce something useful. Sometimes that meant 4 M8s and a couple of jeeps attacking a much larger German column outright, not because the raw math favored them, but because striking from an unexpected direction at unexpected speed produced something more valuable than a single destroyed vehicle. Panic, and panicking troops abandon equipment, get separated from their units, and tell you considerably more in 10 confused minutes than a week of careful, patient observation ever would. One officer, unnamed in the surviving dispatch, summarized a single week's results almost matter-of-factly. 500 prisoners taken, an unknown but substantial number killed, more than 30 vehicles destroyed, and 9/10 of that fighting simply the product of stumbling into it rather than any planned engagement. I think that last detail is the actual key to the whole story, more than any single tactic. If 9/10 of your combat contacts genuinely are the product of aggressive opportunism rather than deliberate orders from above, there is no real pattern for an opposing intelligence officer to build a predictive model around, no schedule gap when a given route will be safely unguarded because the Americans using that route were never operating on a schedule an outside observer could reconstruct in the first place. This wasn't disorganization in any real sense. The Ghosts maintained their radios, their vehicles, their supply discipline, and filed detailed reports up their own chain of command. But within those constraints, tactical decision-making sat decentralized to sergeants and lieutenants at a level the German command structure simply wasn't built to accommodate, let alone counter. Much of that freedom traces back to one specific officer working alongside Patton, rather than under him tactically. Brigadier General John K. Waters, a West Point graduate and Patton's own son-in-law, who spent much of 1943 and early 1944 working directly with cavalry groups on their operating doctrine, pushing a principle that ran directly against the instinct of nearly every officer trained to conserve force for a single decisive engagement. Waters' argument was that a cavalry group's single most valuable asset wasn't its vehicles or its weapons at all. It was simply its presence, unpredictable, and therefore impossible to plan safely around. If an enemy commander genuinely cannot predict where you'll show up or what you'll do once you're there, he has to guard everywhere at once, hold reserves back against threats he can't fully anticipate, and burn intelligence resources, figuring out what you're doing instead of planning what he should be doing to you. German assessments of Allied order of battle largely dismissed cavalry groups as light screening elements not worth serious tracking. Their guns, after all, couldn't hurt a Panzer IV's frontal armor, so why bother? By the time German intelligence staff began systematically tracking the 2nd Cavalry Group's actual movements that August, the unit had already screened 45 miles of corps flank simultaneously, destroyed a German unit roughly regiment-sized near Corrosive, and captured a fort, none of it appearing anywhere in German planning as predicted activity, all of it nonetheless consuming German resources to respond to after the fact. There's a genuinely bitter irony sitting inside Waters' own story that's worth naming, because it shows exactly what happens when the doctrine of aggressive unpredictability gets applied without the cavalry's actual training and equipment behind it. Waters himself had been captured in Tunisia in February 1943 at Sidi Bouzid, while commanding an armored battalion overrun by the same 10th Panzer Division that helped shatter American forces at Kasserine days later. He spent the next 2 years as a prisoner, eventually held at O-Flag 13B near Hamillberg, roughly 50 miles behind German lines. In March 1945, Patton, officially concerned about mass reprisals against Allied POWs as German lines collapsed, though few who knew him doubted his son-in-law's presence in that specific camp was the real motive, ordered a task force of just over 300 men under Captain Abraham Baum to punch 50 miles behind enemy territory and liberate it outright. a raid built on exactly the same premise Waters had spent a year teaching cavalry officers: speed, aggression, and unpredictability substituting for numbers. Unlike the 2nd Cavalry Group, Task Force Bomb had neither the doctrine's supporting infrastructure nor its element of genuine surprise. German reconnaissance spotted the column early and shadowed it most of the way in. The raid reached the camp on March 27th and collapsed into disaster. Of roughly 300 men, 32 were killed and the overwhelming majority of the rest captured or scattered, with only a handful making it back to American lines. Waters himself, attempting to walk out under a flag of truce to make contact with the approaching Americans, was shot and severely wounded by a German guard before the camp was even secured, and spent the following year recovering. He returned to the army anyway, eventually rising to full general, the same rank his own doctrine, applied properly by cavalrymen with the training and equipment to make it work rather than a hastily assembled rescue column, had helped make possible for the men who came after him. One moment that September during the fighting in Lorraine crystallized what German officers were actually up against. A captured SS officer, composed even as a prisoner and speaking reasonable English, looked at the mud-streaked cavalry troopers disarming him and simply asked whether they were the ghosts of Patton's army. The lieutenant confirmed it. The officer nodded as though something he'd already half suspected for weeks had just been confirmed outright, and mentioned that German radio had announced the ghosts destroyed on several separate occasions. Each time, they'd simply reappeared somewhere unexpected instead. The cavalry ghosts, though, were only half of what was quietly breaking German operational planning that year. While light armor was making the ground itself impossible to read reliably, something else entirely was making the air, and the airwaves, impossible to trust. And that story stayed fully classified for 50 years after the war ended. On January 20th, 1944, a genuinely strange unit activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee, officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, roughly 1,100 men on paper armed with nothing heavier than a .50 caliber machine gun. The unit's actual concept had originated with 2 American officers, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris, who'd studied British deception operations in North Africa and spent late 1943 convincing Army leadership that the United States needed a dedicated version of its own. Its personnel came disproportionately from art schools, advertising agencies, radio stations, engineering firms, and theatrical set design departments. Future fashion designer Bill Blass among them, along with a young painter named Ellsworth Kelly, who'd go on to become one of the more significant figures in post-war American art, and photographer Art Kane. These were never men you built a conventional fighting unit out of. They were exactly the men you built something else out of entirely, and under its first commander, Colonel Harry Reeder, that's precisely what happened. The men of the 23rd would never fire a shot in anger at a German soldier across the entire war. Instead, they'd carry out somewhere between 20 and 25 major battlefield deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, credited afterward with saving something on the order of 15 to 30,000 American lives. Their story stayed classified for 50 years. When it was finally declassified in 1996, an Army analyst reviewing the unit's mission files wrote that rarely, if ever, had a group this small had this much influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. What the 23rd actually did depended entirely on understanding, and then deliberately feeding, exactly what German reconnaissance could still detect by 1944. German aerial reconnaissance capability was in genuine decline that year. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and Allied air superiority steadily grinding down overflights of France. But what remained could still photograph troop concentrations, vehicle parks, rail movement, and bridge construction perfectly well, and German signals intelligence remained genuinely excellent, intercepting American radio traffic, and even where actual decryption failed, drawing solid conclusions from traffic patterns alone about unit locations and movement. The 23rd built its entire operation around feeding both of those still functioning German capabilities, convincing lies rather than trying to evade them outright. The unit worked with three distinct tools. The visual layer came from the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, operating inflatable rubber tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, jeeps, and even dummy aircraft, inflated with gasoline-powered compressors and positioned to read from the air as a genuine armored formation, painted with enough accurate detail by the unit's own artists to fool experienced photo interpreters. In some operations, simulating entire armored divisions complete with fake vehicle parks, dummy ammunition depots, and laundry lines hung with clothing carrying the correct unit insignia. The sonic layer came from the 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special, working with engineers borrowed from Bell Labs to record the sounds of armor and infantry onto high-quality wire recordings, the direct technical predecessor to magnetic tape, mixed and layered like a genuine production for whatever scenario was needed: tanks moving, truck convoys, pontoon bridges under construction, men shouting orders, played back through powerful amplifiers, mounted on half-tracks, loud enough to carry 15 miles in the dark to a German listening post genuinely expecting to hear exactly that. The radio layer was arguably the most technically demanding of the three. Specialist operators studied the individual radio signature of every American division they might need to impersonate, not just frequencies and call signs, which could simply be changed, but the specific rhythm and habits of individual operators keying Morse code, a pattern nearly as distinctive as a fingerprint to an experienced listener on the other end. German signals intelligence picking up a familiar operator's touch could reasonably conclude a specific armored division sat in a given sector, while the real division in question was, in fact, 200 miles away. Private George Dramus, a 23-year-old signal specialist from New York, later described the basic idea about as plainly as anyone connected to the unit ever did: building a force of roughly 1,000 men and trying to convince the Germans they were looking at something far larger, holding a position with a skeleton crew while the actual divisions quietly pulled out and moved to attack somewhere else entirely. Genuinely dangerous work given the unit had nowhere near the firepower to survive a real frontal attack if the bluff ever got called. Think through what that actually does to a German intelligence officer's information problem. Radio traffic places an American armored division at position X. Aerial photography confirms 50 to 70 vehicles sitting in a park at position X. Listening posts report the unmistakable sounds of armor and bridge construction at position X. 3 independent intelligence sources, 3 separate collection methods, all confirming an identical picture, and all 3, simultaneously, completely fabricated. The tanks are rubber, the vehicles are inflatable, the sounds are recordings pulled from a wire spool. The radio operators are art students from Philadelphia, carefully impersonating the 6th Armored Division, while the genuine 6th Armored Division moves 300 miles away to attack somewhere nobody's watching at all. The 23rd's first real test came at Brest that August, using all 3 deception layers together for the first time, and confirmed working by confused German prisoners who'd been placed defending against threats that existed purely as recordings and rubber. Its most consequential early operation, though, came that September, codenamed Bettemburg. Patton's Third Army was attacking the fortress city of Metz, and roughly 25 miles of front between Metz and Luxembourg City sat held by little more than a single cavalry squadron. The actual 3rd Cavalry Group under Colonel James Polk, a genuinely thin screen of perhaps a few thousand men where the Germans, if they'd recognized how lightly it was actually held, could plausibly have driven straight through, cut Patton supply lines, and threatened to collapse the entire Third Army advance. The 23rd was ordered to plug that gap and convince German intelligence roughly 6,000 men were holding it. For nearly a week, well under 1,200 artists and engineers held 20 miles of front line with inflatable armor, wire recordings, and radio operators impersonating an entire division's headquarters staff, while German patrols probed the sector, found exactly what they'd been sent to find, and withdrew rather than pressing the attack. While the 23rd was quietly manufacturing false intelligence on one side of the front, the cavalry ghosts were doing something different, and in the long run arguably more corrosive, to German operational planning on the other. It wasn't simply that the 2nd Cavalry kept appearing where doctrine said they shouldn't. It was that German commanders started second-guessing every single report they received about American activity anywhere. If light American units could genuinely operate 30 miles behind German lines and hit supply columns without warning, what did a report of no American activity in a given sector actually mean? That no Americans were present? Or simply that the Americans who were there hadn't been spotted yet? For German intelligence, absence of evidence had quietly stopped functioning as evidence of absence, which is close to the single most dangerous thing one army's intelligence apparatus can do to an opposing one, not defeating it outright, not blinding it, but making it fundamentally unreliable, turning every incoming report into a live question mark. By that autumn, German divisional commanders were holding reserves back not against known specific threats, but against merely suspected ones, and reserves held back can't attack, can't reinforce a genuinely threatened sector, and can't concentrate against whatever the real main effort actually turns out to be. The operation that pulled every thread of this story together came in March 1945, and the Germans themselves helped the 23rd pick the target city's name for it. Operation Viersen, run between March 18th and 24th along the Lower Rhine north of Cologne, stands as both the unit's largest deception of the war and, by most later assessments, including the Army's own official post-war history of the 23rd, its most technically accomplished. With the 9th Army needing to cross the Rhine, one of the last significant natural barriers left between the Allies and the German heartland, wide, fast-moving, and backed by defenses the Wehrmacht had months to prepare. German reconnaissance, degraded but far from dead, still had a reasonable chance of identifying roughly when and where the real crossing would happen. And concentrated reserves at the actual point could have turned the operation into a slaughter. The 23rd's job, conceived and coordinated by the unit's own liaison officer, Lieutenant Colonel Merrick Truly, attached directly to 9th Army's own planning staff, was to simulate the assembly areas of two entire infantry divisions, the 30th and 79th, in a sector well away from where the real crossing would actually happen, north of Cologne rather than the genuine crossing point further south, using every tool the unit had ever developed simultaneously. More than 600 inflatable vehicles across two notional divisions, complete with dummy liaison aircraft, sonic recordings of pontoon bridge construction running for consecutive nights, and radio operators who'd studied the real division's individual keying signatures closely enough that their transmissions were essentially indistinguishable from the genuine article. Aerial photographs of the fake positions reportedly looked convincing enough that German artillery began pre-registering targets against ground holding nothing but rubber and painted canvas. On March 24th, 1945, the 9th Army crossed the Rhine near the real point with remarkably light resistance. Most tallies put total crossing casualties in the low dozens, while German reserves and a fair amount of Luftwaffe attention sat oriented toward a notional division that existed only in recorded sound and inflated canvas 10 miles off. 9th Army's commander, Lieutenant General William Simpson, sent the 23rd a formal written commendation shortly afterward. Across the entire war, the unit lost 3 men killed out of roughly 1,100, against somewhere close to 25 documented deception operations run against a fully professional, deeply experienced opposing intelligence service. Bill Blass went back to fashion. Ellsworth Kelly went back to painting. The unit's own men were sworn to silence, and the story stayed sealed in a file cabinet for 50 full years, until its 1996 declassification, followed decades later by formal recognition. Congress, voting the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, signed into law in February 2022, 77 years after Viersen. Colonel Reed's own war didn't end with reconnaissance reports. In the final days of April 1945, with a German officer approaching under a white flag to beg for help rather than simply surrender, Reed's 2nd Cavalry Group used that same trademark boldness one last time, negotiating a local surrender, fighting alongside the same German soldiers against a Waffen-SS unit still holding the area, and driving well over 1,000 rare horses, including Vienna's Lipizzaner breeding stock, across contested ground to safety in what became known as Operation Cowboy. Reed's own explanation was disarmingly simple, that everyone involved had seen so much death by that point in the war that they wanted, for once, to do something beautiful instead. I don't think it's an accident that these two very different operations, armored cavalry treating information gathering as an act of violence, and unarmed artists treating deception as a full-time production, trace back to the identical underlying insight, even though almost nobody involved in either program described it in quite these terms at the time. German military doctrine, built up steadily since the 19th century, held that reconnaissance had one clearly defined job. It observed, and it did not fight. It produced information, not facts on the ground. The Americans had, mostly without ever articulating it as a unifying philosophy, turned reconnaissance into something that manufactured facts instead of simply reporting them. The cavalry groups didn't merely watch German dispositions, they altered German dispositions by appearing where planning said they couldn't, fighting when doctrine said they should withdraw, and forcing German commanders to burn resources they couldn't spare, responding to threats that often existed for only a few chaotic minutes. The Ghost Army didn't observe German positions either. It created them, placing German reserves and artillery against targets that were never actually there, and then watching German commanders make real operational decisions based on completely fabricated reports. Neither the Wehrmacht's doctrine nor its institutional culture had a real category for an army willing to gather intelligence by manufacturing situations rather than simply observing existing ones, or for turning the enemy's own excellent reconnaissance apparatus into the delivery mechanism for its own deception. Both threads had already converged once before, months earlier that September in the fighting at Ericourt in Lorraine, a battle this channel has covered in detail elsewhere, worth recalling here only briefly. Weeks of patient cavalry reconnaissance had mapped every ridgeline and approach route German armor would eventually have to use, meaning American gunners were frequently aimed at a given piece of ground before German tank crews had even located it themselves. Reconnaissance, in a real sense, having already decided that battle's outcome before the shooting genuinely started. So we returned to that German intelligence officer, correctly convinced American reconnaissance was impossible to predict and wrong about exactly why. He assumed he was looking at chaos. He was actually looking at a deliberate doctrine of unpredictability, a choice made at genuinely high levels of American planning that the most dangerous force on a battlefield isn't necessarily the most powerful one. It's the one whose behavior simply cannot be anticipated. Bernie Bluestein joined the Ghost Army at 19 after spotting a deliberately vague recruiting notice pinned to a bulletin board at his Cleveland art school, and lived to receive the Congressional Gold Medal in 2022 at age 98, describing the unit's mission afterward in about as plain terms as anyone connected to it ever managed. That their job had simply been to fool the enemy, to put on a genuinely big act, said without much drama, the way men who did something extraordinary under real constraint sometimes describe it decades later without needing to inflate it any further. Lieutenant Kratz from Chicago, the artists who painted rubber tanks in the dark, the radio operators who trained their own hands to sound like strangers hundreds of miles away, none of them left monuments in any conventional sense. They left after-action reports and radio logs sitting in the National Archives, and a nickname handed to them, not entirely as a compliment, by the men they spent a year quietly outmaneuvering. If your father or grandfather served in any reconnaissance unit of this war, cavalry groups, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, or any comparable intelligence or observation outfit, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments, because these men were sworn to silence for 50 years, and the least this comment section can do now is make sure that silence finally fully ends.